Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again and welcome to Elevating Digital Roles. This is session number 2 in the series. If you missed session 1, we will be doing a slight recap today, but I do advise you have either watched session 1 or will be able to after this, and you'll be shared the link from the previous session after this via email. So just to introduce you to who will be speaking today is we have 2 speakers. Myself, Ashley Larkin, I'm one of the BCS key account managers here. I work with lots of different organizations, helping understand skills and capability gaps through some of BCS's own products. And I've also brought on the call with me once again, Andrew Barnett, who is our BCS technical consultant, and I will let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Ashley, and thank you everybody for taking the time. I hope you get some value out of it. So yeah, my name is Andrew. I'm one of the consultants at BCS. I spend most of my days working with capability teams within various organizations, trying to tussle with a range of workforce planning. But yeah, very pleased to speak with you today. Thanks, Ashley.
Amazing. So as I mentioned, this is part 2 in a series. So I wanted to focus on what today's session will be about. Last session, we focused very much around understanding skills and capability gaps. This is very much focused around benchmarking. So I'm sorry, last session was focused more around building roles and making sure those roles are fit for purpose. So today's session, the challenge we will focus on today is that many organizations struggle to assess their team's skills against industry standards and identify areas for development. And hopefully what we're going to cover is how to benchmark capabilities, identify gaps, and create structured development plans. Now, all of this, the last session, everything we spoke about was underpinned by the use of frameworks. This session, we're going to be focusing on benchmarking to a standard, or if you would like to call it, a framework. So the first question to ask is to understand, why is it important to benchmark to an industry standard or framework? Well, first of all, let's discuss what an industry standard is. So an industry standard is, it refers widely to accepted benchmarks, which is apt as what we're going to be talking about today, best practices or expectations that define skills, qualifications, responsibilities, performance metrics, and for roles within the IT and digital sectors. And this is where we're going to talk about today, is how benchmarking against those roles gives you an organization an understanding of alignment with industry of what is currently seen as that best practice to help identify overall skills gaps. And part of the reason often we're brought into organizations is to create that culture that's focused around professional development. And Andrew, as one of our technical consultants, would you be able to sort of add a little bit more color to why organizations seek to use an industry standard or framework, if you like?
Thanks, Ashley. I think the last point there, it's a very good, I would suggest, an effective means of engaging with staff to create or start to have a positive effect on the environment on the ground. So having information or a standard or a framework, if you will, that's informed by those in the field, peers, is useful to sort of bring into the equation, both to ensure that people are working to these good practices or mindful of them for the ones you've chosen are relevant for your organization, but also equally, wherever that individual in your organization may end up, it's quite advantageous for them to be mindful of these ways of describing skills and capabilities that might help them in their career beyond your organization. So maybe just a few, but I think you've captured them really well, as in the broad range of the reasons why it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that sort of touched upon why it's good for an organization. And I think we were speaking about this earlier. That it's important not to lose sight of the individual who goes through this experience, because by having an alignment to an industry standard, having their role aligned to an industry standard or framework, it does really create, it clarifies what career development and the role expectations are. Because if you've built a role out, and this goes back to our previous webinar on focusing on building that role around an industry standard, is it creates that expectation of what's expected of someone in that role. But what it also does is once you've benchmarked yourself against an industry role, which the majority of today's session, by the way, is going to be focused on Andrew taking us through the benchmarking process, whereas last week he was taking us through the role building process. It builds it on the idea that an individual's development is focused on the current role they're doing now, but also future any future roles that they would potentially look to go into as part of a career pathway. And that ultimately, hopefully, is a transparent career path for both the employees and the managers. So from that manager point of view, there's that understanding and expectation setting from an individual that their development is against this industry standard, both in their role and future roles. And from the individual point of view, they know that their development is being focused on the role that they are assigned to. Now, we're just going to do a quick recap now for those who weren't able to join us last time on some of the frameworks that we use. Well, the main framework we use, which is SFIA, which stands for Skills Framework for the Information Age. We do run through this in the last presentation, but I wanted to make sure we sort of have that grounding of what SFIA is. So SFIA stands for Skills Framework for the Information Age. It was created by the SFIA Foundation, and it's a way of sort of taking out the jargon from describing IT skills and roles. As you can see on the right hand side, it's measured across 7 different levels using the language of follow, assist, apply, enable, ensure and advise, initiate and influence, and set strategy, inspire and mobilize. And at each different SFIA level, there's a description describing what someone would do at that given level. So hopefully everyone has a good grounding of what that SFIA framework is. And when we're going to be talking about how we built the roles previously and when the benchmarking is, we use a granulated version and more detailed version of that framework called SFIAplus, and we're going to show that to you in BCS's own environment called Role Model Plus. I just wanted to go through the differences, Andrew, from SFIA and SFIAplus, as we take a look at a description of SFIA, which is at its broadest level, which becomes a bit more focused when you look in the overall SFIA skill description, and then breaking that down into the components of work activities, behavioral skills, technical knowledge and skills, so that when benchmarking against these individual components, it provides a lot of clarity of whether I am indeed working at this individual SFIA level. So shortly, I'm gonna hand over to Andrew Barnett, because we're going to be taking you through the Role Model Plus system. Now, we're going to assume that you've seen some of last session, which was focused on the role building element of this, but Andrew's going to take over in just a second and show you the benchmarking process from what an individual will go against for their role, benchmarking against a framework, and some of the benefits of this. And if there are any questions at the end, we're happy to go through those. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ashley. Just bear with me. I'm just happen to be using a purpose-built environment to examine and showcase some of the use cases for using frameworks. Just for clarity, and again, these sessions are quite challenging because we're trying to condense down some useful information that we see working well and trying sharing that with a group, knowing full well that every organization is quite different. And to that point, what we're not suggesting at any point is that all your roles should be described using SFIA or GDAD or these other taxonomies. It's really about taking elements that out of the box that would sort of fast track the process. So if you're thinking about, creating roles, creating an environment to help people understand capability, etc., etc. So it is really useful to, if you can, have a thread of SFIA or GDAD or whatever framework it is running through all your roles, thus achieving that sort of connection, if you will, which we'll talk about it in a little bit of time. So forgive me, let's go to a sandbox environment. Sorry about that. So what I'll do we were going to start off, what does a role profile benchmark look like? But as we know from the last session, and we've talked about frameworks, if we're going to use a framework, we're going to be selecting skills, pull them together at certain levels to reflect a role, obviously nuanced with things that are specific to our organization. But I think it's useful to go into the raw framework. And hopefully whilst we're doing that, if I go to my development dashboard here. So again, we can reflect any, just to illustrate the point that, you know, we should accommodate as many frameworks as relevant behavior, whatever, but focusing on SFIA to illustrate this point. And when we talk about benchmarking and SFIA and GDAB, but SFIA in particular, we'll use that for today's example, is useful as a bit of a shorthand, a bit of an advanced position to take. And it does stand up to rigor. There is an entire process, an ecosystem that supports and maintains the framework itself. And that's quite useful for some of the reasons I suggested. But even if maybe you have two groups of BAs who can't agree upon what a BA role might look like, having the SFIA version of those descriptions with the weight of the SMEs who contribute to it may well prove to sort of break that deadlock, or at least reach some sort of accord as to what a BA role should look like, as I said. But one thing about benchmarking is really quite critical, and I think this was the best way of doing it. So I'm doing two things here. Number one, expanding a little on the level descriptors that Ashley shared earlier. Again, so people, if you ask people to say, okay, using SFIA as a lens, what is it you feel you can do? And we're just not thinking about roles at the moment at this juncture. So it's really important to have an appreciation, if I may just click on one, what the various levels represent. So level 1 skills, anything in the level 1 column represents a relatively junior point in your career. Level 7 is going to be describing a very senior individual and the senior point in their career. And each level has the same description around, different descriptions, but same titles around autonomy, influence, complexity, knowledge, and business skills. So if you are considering using SFIA and you are asking people to benchmark against their capability, or even when you're trying to decide which level of skill you need for the role that you have in your mind, whether it's a junior or senior role, you need to have an appreciation of what the fundamental levels represent. And that's your first sort of pass, if you will, is to benchmarking or using that framework to help draw out capabilities that you think you might have. So do spend some time. This is all in the public domain. There's the SFIA framework. We talked about SFIAplus a moment ago, but SFIA framework is in the public domain. So that is one thing I would urge people to review and consider. And often it is the case that that information is used to map against internal pay grades or internal structures within, or progression structures within an organization. So now we've covered that off, we can look at a particular skill. So the scenario, and not an uncommon one, and one that we advocate is, again, roles aside, we might want to use this environment, let's say, to say to people, well, let's try and socialize the framework. Let's use this to gather as much intelligence as we can on the capability of our team. So people get an opportunity to, you know, in this environment and using this framework, which is positioned correctly as informed by industry, what are the capabilities that you feel that you have? So that's quite a useful leverage or tool or tactic, if you will, when engaging with organizations. So for instance, I might think that in a previous employee or a role that I do as a volunteer work, I have particular skills that I think focus around formal research. So I'm led there by the naming convention, although that's, again, penned by those in the industry. So we're beginning benchmarking now, and it's relatively straightforward. We can talk about it in more detail in a moment when we look at the roles and other supporting materials that we can add to it to support that. But just looking at the raw skill, if you were choosing to use SFIA or maybe one of the government frameworks, it's structured in a broadly similar way. So you've got what is formal research as a skill, and it can exist over several levels as determined by the SMEs out there in the field. And it describes, in this case, because I've clicked on it previously, that skill at level 3. Now, I may be very confident in this is something I'm absolutely doing, but to Ashley's point earlier, if there's any doubt in my mind as to whether I can perform that skill, or I'm certainly going to tell the business about it, but I want to be absolutely clear that it's something that if asked, called upon, I can do. So you might want to quickly look at our version or SFIAplus's version, and it could be your own. In a lot of environments, this has been tailored to mirror an organization's expectations of being able to perform a certain skill, but it's just an example out of the box. but you can provide people with additional level of granularity of that particular skill. And this is quite a useful one. So work activities, as suggested by those in the field, if you have that skill at this level, you should be able to turn your hand to these particular tasks. And if the answer is in the affirmative to the vast majority, that's how we gain, we like to suggest, a more accurate picture of capability. Basically, the individual has more information to base their opinions on. Now, one thing that I'm assuming everyone on the call will, this will resonate with. Someone may, that's a bad example, but let's go to, I can search this. I'm just going to go down to another skill, portfolio management. So often I get asked, or people say to me, I've got a qualification, therefore I'm capable of X. So I've clicked on portfolio management. I can interrogate, they might say it's a Prince 2 qualification, for instance. So what you're able to say to that individual, that's fantastic. It's great that you've achieved that qualification. You can draw their attention to, again, that qualification in the context of the skill that you might be using in your organization. So that's a useful additional bit of information I thought we could share with you here, but it enables you to just expand or share with your colleagues some that qualification in the context of the broader skill, as I said. So that's framework. So again, just be mindful or be conscious of the various levels and what they represent. And if you're asking people to benchmark, I wouldn't benchmark against level 7 skills or 1, probably something around 4 or 5. Best probably reflects where I am in my career or capabilities, speaking broadly. So going back to, again, we've made the conscious decision to use in large part frameworks that already exist. So that's the scenario here. And again, the benchmarking that we see most frequently is an organization will purposely select various skills at various levels to reflect the roles and responsibilities within an organization for the reasons we've mentioned earlier, consistency of language, etc., etc. And the benchmarking is performed in the same way. So all that information that the organization has pulled together is presented to an individual in the form of a role profile. And again, if you've used SFIA in the past or any government frameworks, the broad principles apply. You select specific skills at certain levels to reflect roles and responsibilities. You're not limited to that, and there will be things that are specific to an organization, behaviors, etc., things that make you unique. They will also be reflected in here, but for illustrative purposes, we're just using frameworks. Again, interestingly, this particular environment knows something about me already. This is actually one of the principles of our tooling, actually. But so this role that's been applied to me this morning, interestingly, uses 2 SFIA skills and 2 items that are specific to this sandbox environment to reflect nuances of an organization. And again, the same applies. I've got some additional information, so you have that additional granularity to support the original benchmarking. And what we've not really touched on here, but we maybe in a minute if steered by Ashley, is to how the additional granularity not only assists in helping paint that accurate skills picture initially, but once we get going, the use of frameworks, the use of consistent language, perhaps the granularity as well, helps people, maybe junior, move through to other roles that are being identified to them as a match. So that's where the additional things and other things you can hang off roles is quite useful, but we'll get into that in a minute. But the benchmarking against a role, this is constant. I haven't really seen it done. This is the standard way of doing it, if you will. There are differences, and we can talk about a few. You might want to add a diagnostic to this role. That is entirely possible. Add it as a training activity, which we'll look at in a sec. But again, as before, bit of consistency here. So we have the skill level, the skill descriptor. So what business analysis is. This is for those eagle-eyed amongst you. This is an older version of SFIA we're using for this, and it describes BA, because the BA skill has been broken apart just for clarity. And you can then review the skill level descriptor as well. And again, typically in an environment such as this, I know that it's asking for me to be a level 5. I'm currently level 3, and you can make a choice whether I actually am a level 5 based on what I've been provided with, Am I above or am I below? Downstream, that then starts to inform some of the data that we'll talk about in other sessions around where are we overskilled, underskilled, etc., etc. But in terms of benchmarking capabilities, 101 is really in a sensible fashion presenting the skills descriptions as you've determined in the role profiles to the individual, citing all the reasons why they should be motivated to participate, progression, have training, etc., etc. And it's a case of presenting it to them in a sensible fashion. And just finally, before we segue, are we looking at how that create a little bit of career pathways? Okay, so just very briefly then, I'm going to a particular role's been flagged to me here. And again, I can't stress this enough, one of the advantages of using frameworks, when you independently create a BA role family, and then over here you independently create the solutions architect role family, what will happen is benchmarking and against the BA role, you are automatically leaving traces of capability on the solutions architect role. Everyone is aware of an overlap. And what in certain environments do will highlight that to the individual. So for instance, it's telling me that this role has been flagged to me, where I'm a skills match, where I'm a skills adjacency, what I need to develop, and if I want to, I can benchmark. And what I wanted to show you is for this particular role. Now, in my mind, the scenario is this role has been flagged to me based on a matching of skills. I can obviously fine tune that, update the benchmark. I won't at this point. But what me and Ashley were talking about earlier today, one thing we really wanted to get across is whenever you do this exercise of benchmarking, asking people to benchmark, it's critical because you are going to induce a level of anxiety in that process. So it's really important to have this whole thing positioned correctly. One of the key things is being really front and center and overt about the initial thing we want to do is help you to develop. So in order to do so, you have to do the benchmark. We'll examine the data that comes out the back end of that later on. But what we've done here, quite crudely, is within that particular role, I'm a junior working towards this role. And within here, we've called it training activities, but you can create anything you like. We often have organizations who have entire learning pathways attached to a role. So I can pull that through to my plan and work on it. If I actually did click on that, it's already in my development plan. It would send me off to a completely different environment. And I can do some, in this case, it's I think an e-badge within the BCS membership offer, just to illustrate the point that we can go to different environments. But the point there is, if you are going to do benchmarking, be very clear of the frameworks and the advantages of using these frameworks, both within the organization and throughout their career. SFIA is very good at achieving that in my experience. And if you're doing that, go to some trouble, get ahead of the curve, and think about all the learning that can be attributed or attached to the role, again, to support that whole creation of a CPD or continual professional development that Ashley mentioned at the outset. So I'll pause there, Ashley, I think, unless there's something you'd like me to look at very briefly. I think leave it on this note here, which is around, again, once the benchmarking, it's probably useful to show you with why we do it. This happens to be a representation of a certain career pathway within a fictitious environment. It could be a special project team. It could be a client you are working with and you've described roles and responsibilities. But whilst you're developing, as we've just sort of touched on earlier, people can actually start to repurpose, again, in this particular environment. But once you have an appreciation of capability, it can be used, and you're using frameworks, it can be used in all manner of other ways. So I will pause there, Ashley, if that's okay.
No, I think that's great. I think before I come back to my slides, I think what you've seen there is a really great illustration of what benchmarking can achieve, and we'll come to that in future sessions. It's quite challenging, as Andrew said. These sessions are quite short, but by the ability to benchmark both at framework and role level, allows, from an individual point of view, whether you use a BCS environment or another one, the ability to see from an individual point of view how you stack up against other roles within an organization. If you're building roles using a consistent language, and I think that's something we've spoken about quite a lot, and having that ubiquity across role descriptions allows for that ability to be more of a developmental organization. I think certainly I think about you, Andrew, that a lot of the organizations that want to work with us and want to adopt this sort of ethos is around that sort of career mobility that potentially is difficult when you have legacy roles or role descriptions that aren't quite fit for purpose, which again is sort of feeding back into the previous session. But by benchmarking yourselves against those roles and frameworks and having this sort of standardized approach really allows, from an individual point of view, that mobility in terms of professional development. And what we'll touch on in next session, which I'll sort of bring up in a second, is around that workforce planning. Okay, we've done these benchmarkings, we've built these roles that are industry standardized and are fit for purpose. We've had our staff benchmark against those roles, so they, from an individual point of view, understand what's expected of them in terms of skills and capability. What do we do with that data next? And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to dig into on the next session. So with that in mind, the next sessions are going to be focused around that workforce planning and planning for the future. Hopefully, we're going to bring some real insights from some of the organizations that we've worked for, because a lot of what we focused is what you do at the outset. The next piece is what you do with that data and with that benchmarking and with those roles created. And then ultimately, how do you start using that to plan for the future in another session? And then finally, on the 12th of April, we'll have a session specifically for those in health and care, because we've been doing a lot of work with NHS to build standardized roles and systems. So hopefully that will be of interest to everyone. Now, I appreciate we've only got 2 minutes left. So if there are any questions, then we will go to those now. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat or shout out, we only have 1 minute left before we have to leave you all.
Just while people are typing, and as you reminded me of the point that we had discussed earlier, and the challenge of these sessions is what we're trying to instill is what we see as effective catalysts for change. I hate that phrase, but if you're partnering with the right organization, you've seemingly got ahead of some of the challenges you're going to face. Like, what do we do now? We've identified the gaps, so training, and also the frameworks as well. So that in my mind, that was one thing I was hoping to sort of to get across, which I think you kind of captured there. But I just wanted to reiterate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see any questions in the chat. Oh. So I'll leave our contact details up here. So if any of this is of interest to you, or you want to have, and we find this a lot easier when we're having this as a more open conversation about how you can implement some of these ideas and thoughts into your organizations or from an individual point of view. Both myself and Andrew are happy to speak with any of you after this. We'll be contacting you after this series to see if there's any way we can help support you and also provide you all the previous recordings. But that, unfortunately, means we've hit 12:45. Oh, we have a question. No, Lindsay saying thank you for an interesting question. So
there was one in the chat, if I may, from James about how do we access the framework. Again, if you want to reach out to us, James, it depends on what you want to do with it, what version of the framework. So James, if you want to email Ashley, or Ashley can email you yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch upon that. So access to SFIA or SFIAplus can be through BCS membership or through a sort of standardized approach that Andrew has shown you some of the environment of that. But happy to have a conversation with anyone on the call.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the time.
Well, I mean, the recording will probably stop now, but I'm happy if there's any more questions. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending this session. I can see someone else is typing, so I'll give you time to finish typing. And so many thanks. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining this session. We look forward to the next session this time next week. If you need anything in the meantime, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.